1992, I did something, I worked for a sheriff's office doing search and rescue. And in 1992, I was a young 21 years old. And we were called on a body recovery. A guy had slipped into a river and drowned and then went over a waterfall and was presumably stuck at the bottom of the waterfall. Let me paint this for you. This is in California in the Sierra Nevadas. It's the North Fork of the American River. This is about a 50-foot gorge with some large rocks coming off, and the river narrows down to a 15-foot span. So it gets narrower in this gorge, and there's just this massive volume of water coming off these falls that fall about 30 to 40 feet down below, and that's where they believe that this guy was stuck. And so we got called out, and we were supposed to do what we could to recover the body for the family. Now it's really sad, but that's what we do at Search and Rescue. We hope to save people from dying, but sometimes we recover them after they have died. And so we were there, and as we got ready to go out there, we decided, look, the best way to get down there, because it's at the bottom of this gorge, and there's massive volumes of water, there was no way to get down to the base to get adequately into the falls. So the concept was that we would put a line across the entire gorge, a heavyweight rope. And then we put a pulley systems on, and they would drag somebody over it, and then they'd lower them down over the falls. And then, because when you're at the falls, you're using a pike pole to reach into the falls to try and grab or dislodge whoever or whatever is stuck down there, you had to do it upside down. So your hands are dangling upside down with your legs twisted around, and you're reaching into a pole, something like that. I know that was artistic, wasn't it? And you are spinning because the water's just turning you. And so, being 21 years old and being young and relatively healthy at that time, my mentor, who was also the team lead for the search and rescue team, said, "Wilson, you're on." And all these emotions came to my mind like, oh my gosh, I may die. Like, if I get caught in this water, what's going to keep me? So all these fears came up, and I was like, oh my gosh. And so I started thinking like, okay, so if this Tyrolean line that goes across and the pulley system and the current mammal weight of the rope, how much weight can it really hold? Can they really do this? And will my team pull me out? Like, will they have enough manpower? It's like all these thoughts are racing through my mind. And all of a sudden something clicked in my head. And it's kind of the training that you receive. It's like you have to trust your equipment and you have to trust your team. So you kind of have to shove the emotion and you say, I'm just going to choose to do it and have faith. That's what we're talking about for the next few months. What does it look like to have faith? What does it look like for your faith not to be something that you believe about, but you actually have to act upon, whether you feel like it or not? So we're starting a new series called Living Faith, and we're going to be looking at characters in the Bible who demonstrated this, and the passage that we're kind of using to talk about this is the passage from Hebrews. The book of Hebrews begins in chapter 11 with this long list of by faith. And it begins with this definition, one of the clearest definitions of faith in the Bible, and then with a bunch of examples of people afterwards. And that definition looks like this. So the first Hebrews 11:1 says, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see." Confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. Another translation words this a little bit differently and says, faith shows the reality of what we hope for and the evidence of things we cannot see. And so I want to give you kind of my definition. I'm going to say it twice so you kind of get it. This is how, if you were to take those passages and kind of try to understand them in contemporary language, it would be something like this. Faith is hopeful confidence in something we can't yet see, but something we choose to place our trust in. We choose to trust. So I'll say it again. Faith is hopeful confidence in something we can't yet see, but something we place our trust in. Something we choose to trust. And so Hebrews chapter 11 begins this long list of explanations of what does it look like to place your trust in something with a hope, with a sense of confidence in the hope of what it is or who it is that you're trusting. And so we're going to be looking at that, and I want to just tell you a little bit about Hebrews 11 is not just a functional definition, but these examples are going to give us a lot of ways that this looks. And I just want to say one thing about this, is that I want you to note something about the characters this week and in the coming weeks, that the actions are proof of their faith. The actions aren't what saved them, but they're proof of their faith. It's the fact that they had faith that saves them, but the proof that they had faith was what they chose to do. They said, I'm going to, regardless of what I feel about this, I'm going to do what I know needs to be done or what God wants me to do. And so, anyway, so let's look at this a little bit more. I want you to see something that's going to be implied here in this passage, that he's not looking for people to be perfect. He's looking for people to trust him. People who choose to live their lives for him, to live their lives in a response of faith. And I want to make a note also about all these characters. None of them were perfect. None of them had it all together. They're like me and you. They had issues. They didn't do it right all the time. But the general bend of their life, the general trajectory of their life was one that said, I want to live for God and what he wants. And then in the general disposition of them was the choices reflected that place. So, we're going to begin by looking at a little bit from Noah's life, and there's a great summary of Noah's life in chapter 11, verse 7 of Hebrews, and I'm going to read that for us. So it's going to say faith 3 times here, and I want you to pay attention to what it is by faith that's happening. So it begins in verse 7 by saying, it was by faith that Noah built a large boat to save his family from the flood. He obeyed God, who warned him against the things that had never happened before. By his faith, Noah condemned the rest of the world as he received the righteousness that comes by faith. A lot of by faiths in this. So these are loaded statements. Let's begin with unpacking a few of these. First, it was by faith that Noah obeyed God. He believed what God said. A flood had never happened before. Never in the history of mankind had there ever been this kind of catastrophic flood. The boat of this kind of dimensions that he was going to describe would have been unfathomable. Nothing that size would have ever been constructed. And then it says it was by faith that Noah's life condemned the rest of the world. And what he's saying there, what we'll see when we look at Genesis chapter 6, is that it was Noah's life was built on trusting God. And it stands in contrast to everyone else who lived at that time, because they pretty much trusted themselves or one of the other many gods that they worshipped at that time. And then we also see that the righteousness that he received was actually by faith. Faith was real because it was active, and it was something that he received. This righteousness means right standing, or this right disposition, or this right relationship with God came because he chose to trust God. And so those are some things I want you to see. And I just wonder, what do our lives say by the choices that we make? Before we get into Genesis 6, what do our lives say? Would the general bend of our lives be, yeah, he had some issues, but you know what? He was really trying to seek God. I could give you a laundry list of the things that I know about myself that I struggle with. My hope is that when people would think about my life, my hope is when people think about your life, is to say, regardless of how perfect they lived their life, the general bend of their life was to really want to live for God. So, this is what we're going to be looking at now in Genesis chapter 6. So we got the summary of what Noah's life is about in Hebrews chapter 7. But I want to take a little bit more and look at Genesis, because Genesis tells the actual story of Noah's life. And many of you may have been familiar with this story. This is a very popular story that's been told. It's an ancient story of a man, a boat, a flood, a promise, and a new beginning. And what's interesting is that the Bible is not the only place that talks about grand floods. And if you're interested in anthropology and ancient history and mythology, I would love to talk to you about that, because I find it totally fascinating. Because the story of Noah stands in some similarities, but stands in some significant contrast to what other people at that time thought about. But I want us to look and begin with verse 6, chapter 9, or verse 9 of chapter 6, that talks about Noah, introduces the story a little bit more. And it says this: "This is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, the only blameless person living on the earth at that time. And he walked in close fellowship with God." So the story opens with this character, this person who lives in close fellowship with God, which is in contrast to this story of humanity's sin and brokenness that grieves God's heart and is separated from God. So there's this standalone person. There was one person who believed in a God who was different than all others. There was one person who believed and demonstrated trust in this God. And there was one person who sought to know and live in a relationship with God. And that was Noah. And this is Noah's story that we're going to read. So now to demonstrate a little bit about what sets Noah apart from these other people, to show that he had this close relationship, this intimate fellowship with God, was really the choices that he made. And so let's look at some of those. So in verse 13, it says, and I'm just going to give you very short things. God said to Noah, and I'll tell you what he said. He said, go build a boat. He gave him exact specs. And this thing displaced over 400,000 cubic feet of water. That's a big, big boat. Big even in today's time. This is a really, really big boat. And considering that there had never been a flood before, there'd never been that mass of water. At that time, before the flood, scientists believed that there was, whether you believe in the Bible or not, they believed that there was some sort of water canopy that preserved the earth when dinosaurs lived, that actually allowed animals and plants and things to survive because there was less UV rays, radiation, all these things. And so there's a water vapor canopy that was over the earth. It was kind of like a protective layer. And when the flood came, it was the dissolution of that water vapor canopy that happened. And so they call the technical term is a diluvium. So anyway, this water vapor canopy was over the earth and now it comes down. And so he built a boat. And notice what it says. It says, God said to Noah. God gave Noah very specific instructions on building this boat. And this boat, the Hebrew word that we translate is often an ark. And the word for ark is only used in the Bible basically in 3 different ways. And it's always to preserve something special. The first is Noah's ark, to preserve humanity and animals, to repopulate the earth after the flood. The second one is the reeds that were put together to put Moses was put into the water to save Moses from being killed by the Egyptians. So that was actually an ark also. So ark, clearly, this word in Hebrew doesn't mean something really big. It means something that's a vessel that holds something very precious. And then the last time that word is really used is the Ark of the Covenant, this thing that Israel walked around in, this box that was wood and then ornate with all this gold around it, these poles. And then what was in it, the 10 Commandments, Aaron's rod, manna from heaven, like all these precious things that showed God's faithfulness. And it was supposed to be the dwelling place, the place that God's presence would reside, something special. So God calls Noah to build something that's special for a purpose that God has in mind. And it's really big, and it makes no sense to anyone who lives around him. And so that's the ark. Now, the other thing that's interesting in this is that God talks to Noah. Now, we don't know what this exactly looks like. The first 11 chapters of Genesis are actually a Hebrew poem. And so we don't know what exactly it means, but clearly God's saying something to Noah, Noah understands, because Noah does what? So, verse 22, Noah did exactly what God had commanded him to do. So clearly, Noah gets the picture. Whether it was verbal, thought, whatever, there's some sort of communication. And it seems to flow from that one statement at the very beginning of Hebrews 11, which says what? And he had a close fellowship with God. Intimate relationship. In fact, that word, close fellowship, is the same word that is used to describe what God was like with Adam and Eve in the garden. Isn't that amazing? And so this is the context. And so there's this close walking of God with Noah. And because Noah actually knows God, he responds to God based upon what he knows and who he believes God to be. And what does his life mark? A life of faith. His life is marked by faith because he knows and follows this God. And there's some sort of communication that's taking place there. God says something and they do it. And I was thinking, what would that look like for us today? And there was this movie that came out a while ago called Evan Almighty. And I found it very amusing because here's this guy who's a politician, and God says, hey, build this ark because there's going to be a flood. Now, not a flood like Noah's flood, but a flood. And You're going to feel it. I'm going to bring all these animals to you. And this guy unfortunately grows all this facial hair. He keeps shaving it and it keeps growing back. If you haven't seen the movie, it's really cute. I'm going to show you a clip of it because I want you to imagine, what was it like for Noah to obey, to follow God, to trust God? Do you realize from the time that it took for Noah to start construction, when God told him to do it, to the time he completed it was 120 years. 120 years. How many of you are going to be that consistent? How many of you are going to live that long? Right? So here's a little clip. Love me less.
Are you concerned at all about Congressman Baxter's tirade and the adverse effects it may have on your bill?
The day it rains and floods and Congressman Baxter takes a ride on his ark, that'll be the day I'll be concerned. Thank you.
His name is Evan Baxter, but now he goes by New York's Noah. Heaven's Evan, the weirdo with a beardo.
Okay, guys, watch it coming through. Watch that.
Marty, can you comment on Congressman Baxter's change in appearance?
Yes, his hair is long. Yes, his beard is unshaven. Are you equally stunned by this man's appearance?
Way things go around here. If he gets any crazier, we may end up in the White House.
Yo estamos afraid que cortando el vivo donde Evan Baxter se ha vuelto un poquito loco.
Okay. So it's kind of a funny, humorous thing, right? But I mean, imagine how he would have to justify his behavior. How would he explain it to everyone else? Like the people hearing the story, recounting the story, seeing this take place, what would that have been like? And I just wonder, 120 years to do something that you think God's calling you to do, and it's difficult the entire time. What do you say? How do you explain it to the people when they don't understand? Noah chose to live by faith. And it says he did in verse 22 of chapter 6, he did everything as God commanded him. He paid attention to every detail. It's almost as if the person recording the story is saying he must have really wanted to please God. He must have really wanted to please God. The story goes on in chapter 7, and it gives more examples of what God says and what Noah does. In chapter 7, verse 1, it says, "Then the Lord said to Noah, now get in the boat that you built, that you've been waiting 120 years for." So he gets in the boat. Notice verse 5 of chapter 7. So Noah did everything the Lord commanded him. Again, he's, okay, God, whatever you say. Again, lots of details in this story, and everything he did, he sought to follow and obey God's leading. Then the story tells of a flood, and then them floating, and then finally faith. And you know what? It was 10 and a half months that he was on that boat. 10 and a half months. You know what's crazy? Is you don't hear God talking to Noah for 10 and a half months. I'm not sure if he did or he didn't, but there's nothing recorded in the story. And what's interesting, there's not a whole lot that God says to Noah in 120 years before he starts construction, before he tells him to get on the boat. Any of you struggle with hearing from God? How many of you waited 120 years or 10 and a half months? Like we want the immediate response now. And if we don't get it, well, God must make sure I'm going to do whatever I think is best for me or what I want to do. Because God's clearly not interested in telling me. Noah really must have wanted to please God, to trust Him. It says in verse 8, in verses 15 and 16, after 10 and a half months on the boat, then God said to Noah, leave the boat. And here's a key observation. I want you to notice in this that this is a response of Noah's relationship to God. So Noah left the boat, and it says, then he built an altar to the Lord, and the Lord was pleased. The first thing he does, after 120 years of waiting, and after 10 and a half months of waiting on a boat with stinky animals, he worships God. He built an altar and says, thank you, God, for your faithfulness. Thank you for your goodness. Thank you for being true to who you said that you were. regardless of what his momentary experiences were like. There was trust, there was worship, there was relationship, there was obedience, there was a sense of living for something other than his circumstances. In chapter 9, then it begins to say, God does a lot of talking at this point. And he's giving Noah a lot of instruction about, okay, what to do now, populating animals and all these kinds of things, and your kids, and go make more kids. And verse 9 and 1, it says, then God blessed Noah and his sons. Verse 8 says, then God told Noah and his sons. Then in verse 12 it says, then God said. And in verse 9 and 17, then God said. And then it says in verse 28, then he died. Then Noah died. A life marked by God talking to him and him doing the best he can to be responsive to who this God that he knew. So what's the point of Noah's story? What's the value in the message? Let's go back to Hebrews 11:7. It was a life that read the passage. I'll read it to you. It was by faith that Noah built a large boat to save his family from the flood. He obeyed God who warned him about things that had never happened before. By his faith, Noah condemned the rest of the world, and he received righteousness that comes by faith. Two things I want you to see that are happening here. It was by faith that Noah obeyed because he trusted God. And by faith, Noah received righteousness that comes by faith. He trusted God. He had a close fellowship, a relationship with God. And he lived his life in response to it. What does that look like to you? To have such a relationship with God that you would trust him with everything. To want to please God and follow him more than anything else. To obey him in the big things, but also the small things. I know for me, when I get really big decisions or these big, hard things that I have to do, in those moments, I'll be like, okay, God, I need your help because this one's beyond me. But in most of the things, I think I'm pretty capable and I just make a lot of decisions. And whether God really wants to tell me about every little decision that I have to make or not, how much do you think he delights in the fact that I asked him? Because isn't the point of asking him about a relationship more than the answer? Do we want to live in a relationship with a God who loves us? Do we want to live our lives in response to that? It's pretty clear it's not just about being good and doing good things, Noah's story. Noah was set apart from everyone else because of the relationship he had with God. He wanted to please God because he believed that God was good, he was amazing, powerful, beautiful, and worth 120 years of labor. And worth 10 and a half months of waiting. So as I think about Noah's life and I think about the value of the message, there's three things that come to me. The first is this: who do we believe God to be? Do we really think he's that great? Do we really think he's worth it? To wait, to trust, to pursue, to love? Do we find him trustworthy? Do we think that actually God's going to do what's best and we're okay with that even if it's not what I want? And the last question is, am I willing to live my life based upon it? It isn't easy. And it's not really about how much faith we have, but what we believe about him and about his desire for us. Because how we view God, our view of him, will determine where our faith is placed. Because if God is a stingy, mean, hard God, that's not going to inspire you to trust him. But if he's a gracious, loving, good God, you might be drawn to want to do that. And if it's true that our words cannot fully comprehend, that they can't fully capture, and our minds fully can't comprehend the greatness and the goodness of God, that they fall short of really articulating that, do you think you can trust him? Because the Bible reveals a God who's bigger and better than the world makes him out to be, and bigger and better often than the church makes him out to be. Here's a trustworthy little saying or truth that you can kind of remember that might be helpful. The more beautiful that God becomes to us, the more we'll trust him. The more beautiful God becomes to us, the more we will trust him. Because we want to trust him. The more fully we appreciate who he is, the more we will live for him. Our lives will be transformed the more beautiful God becomes, the more amazing he becomes, the bigger he becomes. Because he becomes then bigger than our circumstances. He becomes bigger than our struggles. He becomes bigger than our successes. He becomes bigger than our prosperity or our poverty. He becomes bigger than the dividing lines that society and people put up. Because our lives are not just about us anymore, they're about him. Because he's bigger, he's better, he's beyond. God may not be asking you to dangle upside down over a waterfall risking your life. But he asks all of us, will you trust me? And I wonder, what is God saying to you this morning? Are you trusting him? Is it reflected in your choices? Do you want it to be? Do you believe that he's good, that he's beautiful, that he's worth trusting? And are you willing to live your life toward that end? And I just have to tell you guys, it's not going to be in your perfection of following this God. And your view of God hopefully will change more and more, because hopefully he becomes bigger and better and more beautiful over time. And your failures, your failed attempts to obey God, do you know they still please God? Because he knows your heart. Because God's more concerned about what you're pursuing and what you're living for. He'll straighten out the details. Those of us who deal with addictions and struggles, we don't stop automatically, typically, getting over those addictions. It's called failing forward. And the more that you fail as you seek a different end, the more that you realize that God is gracious and good, and the more you want to please him, and the more you hate the thing that you did. God asked Noah to do something. Noah believed God loved him, and he trusted God. God knew what he asked of Noah was possible if Noah was willing to trust him. I didn't know if I was able to do it, to go over the falls, to try and rescue a body, recover a body. But my mentor believed in me, and I chose to trust. I just wonder if he'll do the same with God. If he's inviting you to himself, then he has a plan for you, even if you don't feel like you can do it. The question is, will you just choose to trust him? Trust in his love, trust in his provision, and trust that he can do something in and through you if you're willing to trust him. The question is, will you trust? This is the question that God asks us. This is really the story of Noah, a man who sought to live by faith. And in his desire to trust God, it was credited to him as righteousness. He was seen as right by God. And he entered into a relationship with God that blessed not only him and his family, but all of humanity, really. Will you trust him? We're going to come to